thank you, is a junior double majoring in mathematical economics and psychology. She is from New Delhi, India, and hopes to work in policy specifically on sexual violence. She has over 10 years of experience in jazz, ballet, and modern dance, and taught able-bodied children and adults before creating a dance program for blind female high school graduates. On campus, Jailekha has interned at Haven since her first semester and was recently promoted to a Haven Fellow. Aside from conducting policy research, she created and facilitates Meraki, a movement workshop series that promotes reflection, healing, and community. She also creates and co-facilitates presentations, works with faculty to ensure more survivor-centered classrooms, and helps create and implement thoughtful programming. She enjoys bringing her passion for social justice to all her endeavors, including the Student Contact Board, the South Asian Cultural Club, and her time as a Lambert Fellow. She enjoys good conversation, time with loved ones, spicy food, quirky earrings, and academic meetings, thought-provoking media, and linguistics. Annie Getz Idlehawk is a senior majoring in peace and conflict studies. She hails from a town in upstate New York where there are more cows than people, and she likes it that way. In her free time, Annie enjoys stressing about her thesis. Everyone in this room felt that. Is the leader of community outreach for Kenosiami Senior Honor Society, a Haven peer educator. Thank you, Mom. A member of the Colgate Jewish Union, an activist with Jewish Voice for Peace for Palestinian Liberation, a tutor, a residential community leader, and a Lambert Fellow. In the future, Annie hopes to tread further into academia in order to understand her extensive set of questions regarding atrocity and genocide. Annie hopes that we will ask to see pictures of her dogs and send her names of her favorite theorist, Judith Butler. And with that, I'm going to sneak behind there to turn these mics down because holy moly, these are loud. And then we will get a rolling. So please join me in welcoming these two beautiful souls. No, you can go. And you're just
Hi everyone. So my name is Jailekha. So she, junior, and she, her, hers. Just for some context, so this is abbreviated for a reason. But the title of our talk is Remythologizing Anger: The Productive Uses of Rage. The brown bag was Annie's idea, so you have her to thank for this. Rage is my idea, and we're gonna sort of unpack how the differences and what we mean when we say them. But yeah.
I'm Anna Fenelbach, and I'm she, her, hers, and here's some ground rules. If at any time you need to step out or do anything to take care of yourself, please do that. You matter. Ask questions, and give us feedback. But if you do feel like roasting us, go for it. But please choose fine.
Yes. And yeah,
after the presentation. Okay, so this is our table of contents. First, we will go into working definitions, then some signs, then white appropriation of anger, hysterical much, our case studies, remythologizing anger, and rage.
So, if you are able to, move over one seat to your right and stay on the same side of the aisle. So if you're currently on this side and you're on the extreme right, you will just come back here. I promise there's a reason we're doing this. So I'm sorry to disrupt you, but I promise there's a reason. Yes. Unless, if you want to.
I was over here, so I think over here.
Let's make sure I got my right today.
Oh, wait, you.
This is my right.
Extremely better. I'm so sorry. So people are settled. This was actually Mom's idea from earlier this year. It has the wrong date, but the reason is, how does it make you feel? See? Fine. Okay. How does that make you feel?
Initially resistant.
Okay. Hang on to that. That's good. Any other ideas?
Displaced.
Also great. Okay. The reason that happens, so you change from one scene to the other, right? Your view of this thing, your perspective is probably slightly different now. And point of that is to tease out the discomfort, resistance, leads to growth. Obviously, we're not saying that all kinds of discomfort lead to growth, and no way are we advocating that. But sometimes, given how deeply we hold certain beliefs because of how we've been socialized to believe them and the very young age from which we've been socialized to believe them, it can be very uncomfortable to start to unpack some of those beliefs. So this is just a small exercise in making you understand like how small of a change can still make you feel uncomfortable, and then what does it mean to have a larger change, and how uncomfortable can that make you feel, but still how necessary is it to do that work of unpacking problematic ideas. Okay. So Audre Lorde says anger is loaded with information and energy. Anger is an appropriate reaction to racist attitudes. So Lorde is one of the seminal scholars in the field of womanist studies, and she uses anger to talk about. When she says that anger is loaded with information and energy, she means that it is imbued with a sense of calling people to action and calling people to change, and that action is aimed to help is so that people can change the status quo, because the status quo is inherently oppressive. Okay.
And Sarah Shamali says that anger is an assertion of right to worth, memory, and rage, the demand of accountability. So this shows that it's more than like a one-dimensional emotion. It's the culmination of stimuli, pre-existing conditions, and an inability to accept the lack of popular recognition of one's rights and worth as natural.
Do you want to read out the quote? Just so people okay, I'm so sorry. No, must not wrote down. Okay. So Bell Hooks says in Killing Rage, perhaps then it is that presence of anger, the assertion of subjectivity that colonizers do not want to see, that surfaces when the colonized express rage. Right? So it's a heavy sentence, let's unpack that. When she says subjective experience, the way I interpreted this is that when you are angry about a situation, it means that something is wrong with the situation, right? And subjectivity here is the fact that the people who are colonized do subjectively do view the fact that they are colonized as something to be angry about. It is worth being angry and upset about. And that doesn't suit the agenda of the colonizers, because they're objectively assuming that these people are inherently not worthy of certain rights. So to assert a certain level of subjectivity through anger is to say that your assertion of objectivity, the fact that we are objectively worthy of being colonized, is wrong, and we're going to disrupt that by being angry about it. If that helps me, I'm so sorry. Okay. Brittany Cooper in Eloquent Rage says, to be clear, I'm not really into self-help books, so I don't have one of those catchy 3-step plans for changing the world. What I have is anger, rage, actually. And that's the place where more women should begin, with the things that make us angry. And again, we're not suggesting this is only something that women should be angry about, right? Like, we include trans folks, non-binary folks, queer folks, people of color, people with disabilities. But the point is that why does Cooper say you should begin with anger? If you agree with what Lorde says, when anger, for example, is an appropriate response to racism and other systems of oppression, you can see how a situation that makes us angry is riddled with injustice. And when you notice those injustices, whether they are subtle or overt, so whether it's something like the racist incident, or whether it's microaggressions that keep piling up over time, and the effect of those is not micro, those are situations that harm us. And so being angry about them means we can recognize the fact that they are harming us, and we can identify how these, it's the stepping stone to identifying how these situations are harming us. And then we can begin to both hold space for ourselves to heal, hold others accountable so that the system can change, and then basically work towards holding society as a whole to higher standards. So it's both holding yourself and other people, and then the combination of those will enable you to hold society to higher standards. Does that make sense? This is a lot of heavy language we're saying. Yeah. Okay. Oh, no, never mind. Okay. So the first point, it says anger is an appropriate reaction to injustice. This is pretty self-explanatory, but again, just to be very clear on one point, we're saying anger is an appropriate response to systems of oppression. So when people argue for claims of reverse sexism or reverse racism, we do not classify that kind of outrage as that's not anger in our book. And we clarify what that is later on, but just to be very explicit, so it's not manipulated to fit other ends.
Anger is a catalyst for change. When we say this, we say that anger should drive revolutionary action. It should be the spark to ignite change, and not just where one stops, like gets angry and then stops.
And when we say anger is rooted in empathy, so does that seem like a somewhat counterintuitive idea to folks? Yeah? Okay. So here's why I do think anger is rooted in empathy. This is just what I think. But when you are empathetic towards someone, you are holding space for them in a way that centers their needs rather than centering your own need to feel like you have been of help to them. Right? And that means you have to sit with them in an uncomfortable place. So for example, as a white man, if you have a friend who is, so let's say a woman of color, and you were responding to them, you were trying to hold space for them, in the aftermath of the racist incident, right? Assuming you have all those identities is not helpful. Even qualifying your interactions with them by saying, I know I'm white, but can still not necessarily be helpful. Instead, saying something like, I know this is terrible, how can I be helpful for you? Which is centering what they need versus your need to help, which plays into problematic rhetoric of white savior complex and other types of savior complexes where again you center like your need to help and your need to feel like you have helped versus like what the person actually needs. But all of that is to say, empathy is about connection, and we think that anger is rooted in this because it centers the needs of those who are affected by multiple systems of oppression versus serving the needs of those with more privilege. Trisha and I like to call centering the needs of yourself, if you have more privilege, photivism or photivism. So photivism is a pun because it means false. So false activism, and photivism is when you do something only when someone else is looking. So photivism. Great pun. Feel free to cite us.
Come on.
Yes.
Activism for the inside.
Yes. Okay. Does that make sense? Do people understand our definition of anger? Okay, so psychology is supposed to be a neutral discipline. It's supposed to be a science, right? And for a very long time, psychology thought of anger as being a negative emotion. Big surprise, this was more of a moral psychology finding. The reason I say big surprise is because moral psychology is overwhelmingly populated by rich white men. It's not neutral, in my opinion. And then, on the other hand, intergroup psychology actually argues that anger can be used productively as an agent of social change, right? And again, intergroup psychology is relatively more diverse. So, granted, like you can never use psych or statistics to prove anything, but the point of this is to say that even things that we assume to be neutral might not be neutral. So it's worth questioning your sources. It's worth questioning how you know what you know and whose perspective you know something from.
Okay. So moving into more, I guess, physical manifestations of being unable to express one's anger due to the racialized and gendered understandings of anger. It has been associated with migraines, weight fluctuation, depression. And while these are bad things to be affected by on their own, when understood in with the intersections of the racialization of healthcare and health availability discrimination due to gender, sex, race, class, sexual orientation, age, immigrants, status, etc. The ways that certain bodies are prioritized in being able to have treatment for these issues is significant. Okay, so let's talk about whiteness. So, the type of revolutionary anger we speak of is rooted in the self, the community, and one's intergenerational trauma and injustices. It is the refusal to accept injustices as immutable and natural. Its perversion and appropriation within whiteness is the striving to maintain the status quo and hegemonic power structures. This could be seen in the palpable and explosive hatred of the alt-right and dominant voices who use anger to maintain men's rights and reverse sexism, reverse racism. We love it. This anger is shallow, based only in self-serving interests, working for self-furtherment at the expense of all others. And think of the fury of the men at the Charleston alt-right marches and how their anger is very different than the type of anger we're speaking about.
Mhm. And just to be clear, so when it says hatred is the fury of those who do not share our goals and its object is death and destruction, that's the kind of anger that Annie is speaking about, that is sort of self-serving. In contrast, anger is the grief of distortions between fears and its object is change, is similar to anger is memory and rage, which is the kind of anger we're talking about. So building on these, this was our idea. It says appropriated anger is unbridled rage motivated by the desire to monopolize power. So what do we mean when we say this? We say that appropriate anger is not grounded in empathy. Instead, it's grounded in the continued existence of an oppressive status quo that affects all of us, but differentially harms some bodies over others. Okay, so I'm an econ major and I love using econ to like throw shade at econ. So in econ, a finite good is something that if you have, someone else cannot have it. Right? That's just like a basic definition. So this kind of anger sees power as a finite good that the dominant group has an inherent right to versus something that was systematically taken from present day minority groups. So, for example, women, trans folks, queer folks, POC. So, it was something that was taken from present day minority groups through processes like colonization and heterosexism. Right? Does that sort of make sense to people? Okay. So, qualify the title. The reason we chose to call this hysterical much is because women and people of other non-dominant genders are often seen as overly emotional and sensitive, and they're seen as prone to fits of like unprofessional emotions in general. So here we're unpacking those labels, and we're trying to see how they're symptomatic of colonial and sexist, heterosexist norms.
I said that I refuse to accept that there's a sort of duality between fact and emotion. If we were to lose the ability to be emotional, we would lose the ability to be angry, to be outraged, we'd be robots. So I refuse that. This, which will be expanded upon more in the next slide, it sort of speaks of the creation of a binary, which hegemonic powers love binaries. So yeah, I'll get more into that there. It's just like binary.
And then Audre Lorde says mainstream communication wants racism to be accepted as an immutable given in the fabric of your existence, like evening time or the common cold, which first of all, the phrasing is joyous. But so the thing I would use to sort of explain this is that the norm is the norm only because it goes without comment, right? So when we say, oh, I'm a woman, it sort of furthers the rhetoric of cis women are women because I don't call myself a cisgender woman, right? If I call myself a cisgender woman, I'm not calling out, but I'm mentioning the norm, and that means it has to go with comment, and that means its power as the norm gets undermined, right? So, bless you. So the reason the norm goes without the norm is because it's capable of fulfilling certain societal expectations. What do I mean when I say that? When I say a person, people will often assume an able-bodied person. Why? Because it's convenient to capitalist structures to assume that someone is able-bodied because then they can work and they can be productive both for themselves but also to further the interests of the state and the capitalist economy. Right? So calling out the norm, not calling out necessarily, but calling in the norm means that you disrupt its power because it's been mentioned.
Okay, so let's talk about epistemology. So,
Do you want to clarify that?
okay, that's
Yes.
a way of thinking. It's also one of my favorite words, just so you know. So there is an emotional analytical binary where emotions are understood as feminine, where like knowing things is known as masculine. So that is emotions and feminine knowledge are associated with not being as legitimate or as truthful and objective as masculine things. So that just creates this hierarchy of knowledge. Also, Oyelumi says that the idea of a primordial man and woman is a very colonial idea. The infringement of binaries onto people's lives and into people's ways of knowing is colonial. And just to recognize how these ideas have been pushed onto existing forms of knowledge and used to degrade and many forms of knowledge as Eurocentric, the work of cis white men has been uplifted into the only true analytical, objective form of knowing.
And so we also, the other part to that, adding on to that, is also intersectionality. How many people in the room know that word? Would anyone like, that's great, would anyone like to define, would like to give their own definition of intersectionality, if you're comfortable speaking?
No,
Anyone? Any brave volunteer?
We will give you a high five if you do.
Yeah, we also.
I think it's essentially the idea that your identity is made up of multiple identities, and you can't really understand an overall identity or any one of your multiple identities without understanding how other aspects of your identity impact the others.
Sure. And like maybe to expand on the comment, looking at where it's already seeing the intersection of like tokens of oppression. So think about sometimes like understanding all the identities may be step one in our framework of how we look at it, but then moving into step two of what Kimberly Crenshaw wants us to look at is how do systems of oppression create different experiences for folks who have multiple structural oppressed identities or marginalized identities. And we take out that piece about the marginalization, then we kind of miss again the power imbalances and how many different ways you can systemically over and over and over have your power removed based on marginalized identities specifically.
So part of that is that Crenshaw argues that if you have multiple marginalized identities that overlap with one another and inform one another, you are much more vulnerable to both public and private acts of violence, right, that seek to undermine your status as a human being who is worthy of dignity. So keeping in mind both the masculine and feminine part, but also taking into account how knowledge is racialized, right? So why is a cis white man's knowledge greater than someone who's POC? Why is the colonizer's form of knowledge more valued and seen as more objective than someone who is from a colonist or post-colonist country, post-colonial country? Yes. So, do people know what the term emotional labor means? Yep. Okay. Just to define it briefly, so emotional labor is when it's often used in the context of women of color, specifically Black women. And emotional labor is basically when you are putting in emotional time, effort, energy that drains you of your overall energy, and that is often not compensated, right? So the fact that it goes unpaid is a huge part of it. But it's also, why should you be putting in all this time and effort in order to serve someone else's needs? So when you say hysterical much, the reason I bring up emotional labor is because there's a lot, people will often rely on the emotional labor, especially women of color, especially Black women, in order to educate themselves, right? So why is it that when you need the education, suddenly you will turn to some woman of color who will then educate you with all this intersectional theory, right? But when it doesn't suit you, this same woman or the same person, when they still have those same ideologies, is suddenly hysterical, too woke, too social justice warrior, too sensitive, right? So why is it that you only accept these ideologies when it suits you, according to your needs, according to your desire for education that, again, relies on someone who's not getting paid and who has all this historical legacy of putting in this work, but when it doesn't suit you, suddenly this person can just be classified as someone who's hysterical and too sensitive. And then the part about free speech is there's been a huge increase in terms of universities committing to freedom of speech in the name of academic freedom. And interestingly, a lot of universities, including Colgate, so the commitment to freedom of speech, Colgate's commitment, actually says that it's protecting the rights of those who have been historically marginalized, right? So it actually says that it's for the views that are quote unpopular or unrepresented. So why is it, if it's supposedly for to make space for views that have historically been unpopular or underrepresented, that is actually being used to justify the use of hate speech in classrooms, right? So again, that's a double standard that exists. Am I too much? Which links very strongly to the next point, which I will talk about because both of us apologize too much. But anyway, so yeah. So when you say I am too much, it begs the question: too much compared to what, right? And again, that brings back what we talked about how the norm, when you don't like mention the norm, its power increases. So when you say too much, I see it as too much compared to the norm of a straight, white, heterosexual, able-bodied man, whose life is not inversely affected and whose humanity is not called into question by the systems that govern our society, right? So when you say too much, it basically assumes that you have a certain amount of privilege, which you don't, because you are too much only because you are not, you don't operate the same way that a cis straight white man operates in a society that is set up to serve the needs of cis, straight, white, able-bodied men.
Okay. If you have been listening, you've probably noticed that we have apologized about 15 times for this presentation. Apologizing is a problem. When people need to, well, it's not a problem, but again, who is apologizing and why are they apologizing? Which groups aren't apologizing enough? Why do women specifically and people of marginalized genders keep apologizing for taking up space that has been taken from them and is understood to naturally belong to cis white men? And I read the study where it said that if a woman speaks 30% of the time, men characterize her as too much and taking over the conversation. So if we can fit our words in, and this is undoubtedly further affected by intersectionality in one's identities and how one is allowed to speak and where one is supposed to speak and what they can say, what they can get away with saying without too much drawback.
You were saying sorry, not, like why you should not be sorry about being sorry.
Don't be sorry.
Essentially, right.
Take back the space, but be cognizant of who you are and what space you're taking up.
Yeah. And just to link this even more directly to colonialism, has anyone heard of the divine right to rule? Okay, so the divine right to rule was basically used by a lot of European monarchs back before the Enlightenment, before like democratic movements, to say that rulers inherently had like a divine right to rule, right? So you can see how that logic of divine right to rule, which we see as something that's a relic of like the past, right, is still being perpetuated because you still think you have an inherent right to dominate over certain conversations, right? You still have the right to dominate over a space which is not your own. It's colonized land. So things to think about.
Okay, case study 1. Every brown bag, we say, let's take a moment to consider the legacies that displacement, violence, settlement, migration, colonization have had upon our lives. And then there's a brief pause, and then we move on. Why don't we get angry? Why don't you think of how this place has been affected violently by all of those things, how your family has been affected by all those things, and how your family may have perpetrated those things, and how you can do reparations? We should be using this moment of silence instead of just being like, okay, we gotta be quiet for a hot sec, to reflect and strategize to move forward in collective liberation. It should not just be a second to think, okay, and now move on.
The other case study is the fetishization and mythologization of female and other non-dominant genders and identities, suffering and selflessness. And here I'm going to contrast damsels in distress being desirable with damsels in descent being undesirable, right? I changed it to undesirable. Sorry. Okay, so we should go. But so why are damsels in distress undesirable? Sorry, why are damsels in distress desirable? Does anyone have thoughts?
I said they're white, and because they're white, they're afforded a particular type of protection. A damsel. Yeah, I was just wrestling with the second one. I was like, are they ever damsels? But you know, no, it is no. You all are educating me today. I'm here. But yes, white, and then white assumes a level of frailness, which that frailness attached to whiteness then becomes sexy, whereas frailness attached to other bodies is not sexy, and it continues.
I was just gonna say that I think also kind of the notion of distress allows for like this kind of call for help that allows for those power structures of people that do believe that they're right to continue to like hold that space and assert their beliefs in what is pushing them, whether or not it's accurate or not, or like correct, to continue those in like on putting it onto other people.
So continuing with sort of savior complex, right, and imposing your own beliefs of what helping someone looks like, or if they even need help. Maybe they don't need help. You don't know. But I think it's interesting that we've all heard the phrase damsels in distress. And I agree, like whenever I hear that phrase, someone who's white comes to mind, even though I grew up in India where there are like no white people, thankfully. But we've never heard the phrase damsels in distress, right? And why? Why has that phrase been so silenced? I don't think it's an accident. I think the fact that damsels in distress go against our notions of traditional, and by traditional I mean white because it's the norm, femininity, which basically say that to be a woman is to be submissive, right? And so damsels in distress are undesirable because they don't fit your stereotype of what womanhood should look like in an ideal scenario. And then not only do they not fit that perception, so they are a threat to your own thus far unquestioned power as an individual, but they also serve to disrupt the overarching concept of what womanhood can look like. Yes. Okay. So why is anger coming up a lot now? So just when I say now, there's this brilliant set of articles on Bitch Media about how it's called The Future is Furious, and it's a list of 7 articles, all brilliant. But one of the things they talk about is why is anger coming to the fore now, right? And a lot of it talks about how it's because of the Me Too movement, right? So a lot of, in case you didn't notice, a lot of the books we referenced were actually written in 2018, so during or after the Me Too movement. But that's not the original Me Too movement, right? And the original Me Too movement does not get talked about. So Tarana Burke is a black woman, and her original Me Too movement actually was ignored. She launched in 2006, and it was ignored by prominent white feminists at the time, which also meant that it didn't gain traction. Why? Because white feminists are the one with class power, with educational privilege, and because it was not approved by the people with power in that realm. It didn't gain traction in society as a whole. And she was arguing for a much more intersectional framework, where she was saying we should center the needs of all survivors, not just cis white women with class privilege. We should center the needs of black women, of trans women, of POC, and that simply didn't gain traction in society.
And then it turned into.
Oh, go for it. And in fact, when the new Me Too movement began, no one sort of referred to the original one, right? Which is interesting because the US is so pro-citation. It's so individualistic, right? So why are you not citing black women? Why are you not citing trans and queer people of color who are doing this work, who have put in all this emotional and other labor that they haven't been compensated for, right? So it raises a lot of questions about whose work you are willing to appropriate and co-opt to fit your own needs, but whose humanity you are not willing to recognize by, at the very least, citing them, and at the most, paying reparations. But that's just my, okay, go on.
And then it turned into the more recent time, into the Time's Up, which was solely keeping it within Hollywood, and it was a pin it was it was the photovism. It was by the way, I love Gucci 2019.
Side woman of color. Okay.
And it was done to seem progressive and to raise money, but it was not recognizing the intersections of how oppression occurs and whose survivorship is validated and given attention to. And with the again, you covered the cis white woman, it's hashtag Me Too. It was just reduced to a very one-dimensional understanding of survivorship.
And so what I was looking at how the Me Too movement was sort of taking place in India as well, right? And you could argue that the fact that it exists in India shows that it, and obviously because there are different contexts, you could argue that the fact that it does exist in India was proof that it was an intersection. But again, you have to use localized frameworks. So in India, it was basically used by upper class women, upper caste women. Caste is a whole other system of oppression I'm not going to get into, but yeah, no time. No time. But again, it was not intersectional in the Indian context, right? And which ties into something we're going to talk about now. So what does anger look like in 2019? First of all, anger is intersectional. So no photovism, no photovism. Taking into account all the different identities that might impact someone's experience, and also taking into account which of those identities you share versus which ones you speak for but don't necessarily share. So truly taking into account folks who exist at the margins of society along multiple markers of identity. Radical. So radical is often seen as a bad word. Radical in Latin means root. So it's like Trisha, who loves root cause trees. Being radically angry in 2019 means looking at building on the fact that you have to be intersectional. How are all these systems of oppression linked in a very basic and fundamental way? And how does that translate into someone's lived experience on a daily basis? And then also, how do you benefit, if you have privilege along those lines, benefit from those same systems of oppression in a very fundamental way on a daily basis?
It is empathetic, which means that if you truly care for people, and you have, or a group, or yourself, or your ancestors, you have to be willing to fight for them and to be angry for them and put yourself on the line for them and not to center yourself when speaking of the oppression or trying to be an ally in the oppression of others. It is active, it's not stagnant, saying I'm angry and then doing nothing. You have to do something with it. Passive allyship is perhaps worse than not being an ally at all, because you're saying, yeah, of course I'm on your side, and then doing nothing. This is like people who say that they're an ally to the LGBT community then go to Chick-fil-A, which was instrumental in creating the criminalization with the death penalty. They were one of the lobbying groups that made the death penalty for being gay in Uganda. Like, these are roots of colonial. Everything's so interconnected through colonialism, through homophobia. You have to be active and recognize the way that your power and your allyship and your anger is able to affect many systems.
And we're going to sort of clarify this later on. We're not suggesting that you fight every single day of your life, right? Because it can be tiring, which we will talk about in a second. So when I talk about that, when I say decolonial, I mean decolonial and anti-capitalist, right? And that ties into what I was saying about how it doesn't mean you have to fight every single moment of your life, because it's tiring. You're in any case affected overly so by all these systems of oppression. Your humanity might be questioned on a daily basis. And then on top of that, you have to put in emotional labor to educate people when it suits them, and you have to pretend to be palatable enough to sort of fit in when it doesn't suit them. So when we say decolonial and when we say anti-capitalist, it also means centering your own needs, right? And realizing that you are neither the dehumanized version nor the superhumanized version of yourself. You are a human who is worthy of rest and care and investment, both of yourself and of other people. And we talk a lot about taking care of yourself if you need to. And it might be worth investigating how to change that conversation from take care of yourself if you need to to take care of yourself before you need to? Why should you have to hit that breaking point in order to be worthy of care? It's very ironic I'm saying this because I'm so bad at doing this, but I'm still gonna say it because it might help someone else. Maybe it also might help me. But yeah. Dynamic. So when I say dynamic, I mean anger in 2019 is very different from anger in the pre-Me Too era. It's very different. And it's also different based on locality, right? So intersectional in the U.S. is very different from intersectional in India, for example, right? So dynamic means adapting your anger to suit the needs of the context you are in, and to suit and to also recognize the places where you don't have that much experience. In which case, rather than relying on people to educate you through effort, you do the work yourself, and then you can begin to sort of grapple with the different complexities that exist in different eras and in different spaces. And then lastly, it says cognizant of your own positionality. So this is basically sort of going in line with cultural humility. Do people know that what that term means? Cultural humility. Okay, so I prefer cultural humility to cultural competence because cultural competence assumes that by studying something you can understand it. Cultural humility says, listen, I know I don't have experience with this because I didn't grow up in this situation, I don't have this identity, but and I recognize the fact that I might not have expertise in this because I don't have that experience. But at the same time, I'm going to do my best to educate myself on various fronts. That's linked to being cognizant of your own identities because again, like you can't like I would never presume to be able to relate to the experiences of someone who's trans, right? That's not something that I can relate to. So it is recognizing how your anger can actually be harmful if you assume that you are able to understand everyone's experiences, right? So it's making sure that you recognize the fact that you don't understand everyone's experiences. Okay, so rage, the reason it's abbreviated is because it's an abbreviation, surprise, surprise, but it stands for Radical Acceptance for Global Empowerment. It's a publication that I'm starting. So, rage was born from the desire to have a space so people of marginalized identities and active allies to share personal narratives and intersectional commentary. It is a brave space that honors the struggles that folks of marginalized identities face, while also providing a forum for creative expression, celebration, community, reflection, reclamation, and recovery. Its aim is to foster ongoing dialogue about the experiences of minority communities, as opposed to reactionary conversations in the wake of on and off campus crises. Rage is a call to recognize the differential impacts of various systems of oppression, including but not restricted to, deep breath, cis heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, racism, rape culture, body shaming, ableism, colonialism, colorism, classism, capitalism, Islamophobia, anti Semitism, and other types of religious othering, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, and climate change. We wish to provide an outlet for the complex set of emotions that comes with being marginalized while ensuring arts is a productive and supportive space. In doing so, we wish to create a constructive counterculture of radical acceptance, empowerment, empathy, and scholarship, free of hate speech in any form, and in doing so, enable folks to become more self and socially aware agents of change. I know that's heavy language, but yeah, thanks. So, just to be clear, Rage is not an alternative to reporting procedures, right? So, if you write something down in Rage, that doesn't mean it gets sent to university administration, and that doesn't mean, for example, it would launch an EGP case or something that was related to Title IX, right? It's more of an emotional outlet. Often people will say we don't have space to say this, and then people will only feel like they have space to say something in places like WIMS, in scenarios when there has been a crisis, right, like the recent incident. So this is saying we shouldn't have to take care of ourselves when we need to. It's saying you should be able to take care. It's trying to encourage people to take care of themselves before they reach that breaking point by having like an ongoing dialogue about all of these things. So if you would like to contribute, please email me. My email is up there. But does anyone have any questions on Rage specifically?
How do you help to accomplish?
Basically to not in like the what almost 5 semesters I've been on campus, there has been also the question was what do you hope to accomplish? The it's always that people will say we're doing work and they are, but at the same time, a lot of people don't feel like they've been heard, and this is a way to give people space to be heard. And because so it's online, which means that you don't have to submit like a text thing. You could submit an art project. You could submit spoken word poetry. You could basically do whatever you want, right? And then if you felt there was a need for it to not have your name attached to it for whatever reason, you could also choose to submit anonymously. Like the people who are running the publication, aka me right now, would know who you are. But I will keep that information confidential. It's also, I think, the way very often people will talk about how all their conversations about identity, especially when they have marginalized identities, is related in some way to struggle, right? And it's to say that if you, that is a very real part of our lives, but at the same time, like you are still allowed to celebrate. And this gives people a way that if they want to celebrate, if they want to take something back and reclaim it, this is also a space for that. Yeah. Does anyone have any other questions?
Who do you help submit? Who do you help submit?
So,
What
right.
constituent of the community?
So it's actually open to students, staff, and faculty. In terms of who I hope will submit, honestly, anyone who thinks that they don't have space to raise concerns, don't have space to celebrate themselves or celebrate people in their life. But yeah, it's not aimed to set. I mean, if anyone comes up with like a speech that's full of hate speech, I'm just gonna be like, no, obviously. But there's no like set population. Yeah.
What type of media do people submit?
Oh, I don't know about that. I don't know. But okay, the question was what kind of media can you submit? So you could submit poetry, you could submit prose, you could submit art pieces, you could submit like spoken word poetry. You could do a song if you were so inclined. You could do like a video of you dancing if that was something you wanted to do. It could be a video of you doing a monologue if that was something you wanted to do. It works really well because it's online, so we're not restricted by like the kind of media you're comfortable expressing yourself in. But yeah. Other questions? So the website is set up, but right now, people would just email me if they have interest, and then I will. But yeah, I can like tell Odette if that would be helpful.
Yeah, I just mean like for people to be able to see or I mean.
Well, right now I'm collecting applications.
Right.
Like I'm collecting people's pieces. No, it's not like that because people haven't responded. So it's been a rough semester. Yeah. But yeah, if you would like to contribute, please email me, and then once it's set up, then I will obviously give Odette and anyone else who needs it the website. Yep. Other questions?
We're also having assistant sessions.
Yeah, like not necessarily about Rian, but about the presentation as a whole. Okay, there's something I wanted to say. So in terms of anger being intersectional and being aware of your own positionality, working with Annie on this was absolutely brilliant because one of her questions, like the slides about white appropriation of anger, Annie was like, how can I be most helpful so that as someone who is white, so that you can go in and say what you need to say, right? And that is exactly the kind of action. So it was a joy to work with you.
I'm all flustered.
We wanted to close with this quote by Shimali, that angry women burn brighter than the sun. So when you move forward in your day and your life after seeing this, just remember it and be angry and fight for everyone.
And again, we're not saying just women. We're saying women, like individuals of all marginalized genders.
We're all wonderful, but women especially. But everyone.
Yeah.
But women. But everyone.
Okay. But yeah.
Questions, comments, and
Feedback.
oh, feedback. If you want to roast it, I will roast back. Anyone have any questions? Besides, like, gratitude and things like that.
There's one.
Oh, what? Here we go.
I just want to say thank you to both of you for giving this talk in general because I can't tell you how many times I've gone to other talks at Colgate or had other discussions with my friends or just encountered situations where I feel filled with anger or some kind of desire to do something, and then I sit and I'm like, what is the gestation period of this anger? And when am I allowed to resume my daily life again, or should I always keep this in? And what's the healthiest way to talk about it and deal with it? So I think you guys, I think you did a wonderful, you addressed it in a really wonderful, beautiful, and succinct way. So thank you so much.
And we thank you so much. That means a lot. And I think I would just qualify that also by saying that neither of us are experts on this. And so if you do feel like that is something, not just you, but like anyone, if you feel like that's something that you deal with like a lot, it might be worth speaking to a professional about it, like just to see how you can channel that anger in ways that are healthy and helpful in the long run.
Jailekha, thanks for the talk so much. Actually, like, I'm gonna be real with you. I came here without expectations, and frankly, like, I don't know. I always felt when I encounter an idea or a thought process that I feel is destructive for a group of people, I try to approach that idea and try to deny it or confront the people that are talking about it, or at least be direct about it. But in that sense, I didn't quite concern myself whether or not I was trying to virtue signal in that regard, or whether or not I was just trying to be, or to conform myself to be what I thought an ideal person should be when regarding those issues. Like, of course, committing to my own standards of what I consider to be an ideal person, which is different for everyone. And I don't know, it just feels really ethnocentric and really like gender-centered in my opinion when I talked about it. And now that I know that I can just take a more objective framework or a more like subjective conscious framework, whereas the focus of helping someone else is trying to understand what they mean and then just tackling the ideas and where they stem from. Like, that's such a hard concept to grapple for me. And the fact that I've been exposed to it now, I find it really useful. Thank you.
That's also sort of why we made people move at the beginning, like microcosm experiment. Any other burning thoughts? Well, unless. Well, if you two have closing things, you can share them. But maybe we can all thank Jailekha and Annie for.
Okay. Also, thank you, Odette, for hosting us.
I love you, Odette.
Thank you for clapping for me. Hi, thank you all for coming. Greatly appreciate it. Please reach out to these folks if you're interested in participating, or if you have questions, or if you want to gently roast them.
Especially if you want to gently roast them.
Please make sure you throw all your trash away. Please help stack chairs if you can. Greatly appreciated your effort in maintaining our community here at Women's Studies. Yeah, and I hope you all have a wonderful Tuesday.
tough one. Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Stay up, but around there anyway. So I don't think see you, Lisa.
If you send me that slideshow, I can also talk about it in my classes and stuff, or people have the opportunity to submit.
I read this.
Yeah.
It's really
Yeah.
cool. I really some of them.
Oh, ¿cómo estaba?
Like when would I know just how much?
Yeah, I can ask.
It's so frustrating. I actually.
Yeah, when I was like, yeah.
Because I couldn't go into the second.
Really?
Like I could be outside.
I don't know.
Like
I know that you asked.
you're really good. So you should be like as far as
I think it's funny. Yeah, I know about it.
So
Being away
it's more expensive.
and I love you. But I don't know.
Yeah, but it shouldn't matter that much more. So like you can go to the
I can feel that strong.
I think I know. Yeah, I wouldn't go. I was telling you.
I'm trying to summer.
I think it's
We met one time.
You never know. It is water.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Which is why
It comes over here.
It may be so complicated.
I realized that day I was my nail class so sick. I got treated my nail with it. Now it's like 2 weeks later, so stuck in the LMS.
I still think this was
I emailed the professor and said, hey, I was working on the paper we had to do today, and I realized I never got my last paper back. Then I realized, in my sick stupor, that I never turned it in. So I've attached it, and I understand if you don't want to grade it, but I'd appreciate the feedback. So, expecting a major L there, but that's fine.
Oh, I haven't seen your It's crazy. Like she was when she said you're gonna put it out. Also, I love how like
Yes, it took me half an hour to get ready to change some stuff. No, yeah, I can do that. Shit,
Okay, I'll see you later. Have a good day.
Thank you for your help.
Annie.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, you know, this is. I always make jokes. I wore it and I got came to America.
Which ones are
I'm not gonna. I'm gonna go for my culture.
Australia. Australia.
I just want to say thank you, and I really appreciate you talking. And I wanted to know, would you like to share the slides with me? Some of the resources I really love.
The first
Well, yeah, you understand all the science people on there. And then all, like every single thing you cited, I see yeah, I'm doing my neuro rage.
That's why he's like, there's no way this paint has passed any sort of.
Oh, I guess it's oh. I didn't have
It's really stressful that we get
Excuse me. What is Australia? A secular colony.
I feel like there's always that feeling.
She was always.
We didn't do it.
But I mean, you now identify as.
Yeah. Are you willing or are you?
I got two of them, so like maybe a conversation last time.
It's like, I'm kidding. So glad there's a turn towards anger in the world. After years of like everyone being like sad. Like anger is also like a legit. I guess I'm happy with it.
That's right, it's 300 research.
That's not like you're not weird for feeling this. Like that's
Sure.
It was such a therapy.
like you've been raging. That's right.
No, I legit thought I had to.
There's like a legend at the top. Like you seem like
There's
so.
light because I was
Like your energy is like so different. Like you just every time I see you, like oh my god, you just like you just like you're gonna body slam someone.
Because I just think about such money. It takes better one day after.
because no one else is I'll have 5 classes next fall, and I'm like, if you're gonna just go there and sit on your phone, it's like, why are you doing this?
Yes.
Like, why are you doing I do know other people are so downtown, no. That's canceled for this week. Just using. Oh, yeah. What do you think?
Like sometimes like you feel like yourself like not to understand, but more to like keep up with. For instance, of what like the speaker was saying. Well, like it was really good to follow like the lives of no real phone. So I like that. I think that like the Can we paper clip that one? Or like, I don't know, integrated that, or just smooth it.
I would agree.
Well, hold on, was original.
Oh,
You call me a bug?
see it then.
Oh,
Maybe
you've
I-
been upgrading since
I'm gonna go home.
Yeah.
No, but I like it.
That one of my most favorite is from Costa Rica. Like from Costa
Oh,
Rica.
Oh, he's also like,
Minus the ones.
like in the
Oh, dude, you hit a point where your things kind of like
Same.
I feel like he's just making introductions.
Right,
He's like real cookies.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
Oh.
Yeah, I don't know.
I know.
Did he go to an introduction school? I know I didn't notice. He was from that. Unless his English like crazy American.
It's really
Bye. Bye, friend. Goodbye.
And you're the rest of your day.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I don't like. I don't. I'm not.
Enjoy the rest of your day. You deserve it. You're awesome. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Not her. Yeah, her other. She's here for just one semester. I don't understand it.
What's Kimia?
It's like
You're
different.
extinct.
Yeah.
Justin is having memory issues.
No, yes.
I don't know that people looking here.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying.
What was the notes of that? Because I'm thinking
And
about.
he sang-
You said it was funny, and I've been thinking about
Like
how
on that
Yeah.
side, you brought it after.
how did they like
Okay, I've never had those.
mix joy and translative remembrance?
So it's like that side you brought. It was a mixture
Yeah, no, it
of
makes
like
sense.
their
Like-
poetry. They do their poetry really interesting. They
Just
have
totally
like
opposite.
a
Like,
sound mixer. So they do all of it live, like anything that starts to loop, like they record it in that moment. And
Like with like
then, yeah. So they would do their poetry, and then they would like hop
Like if
into a
you're not just-
monologue. And their monologues had a lot of funny jokes. Like they were just like left and right. They opened it with like, I'm gonna be making a lot of jokes, and if you don't laugh, then I'm gonna spoil it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Like academically, you'd be like, oh,
Correct.
like it must feel like,
And like, I mean,
how
I
can you say
think
you're doing this stuff?
the way that they mixed it was that they were critiquing
But like when people finish undergrad, like
like
overseas,
the
like never
system of
after.
nature.
There's no med school after like
True
that was your
mockery.
degree.
Then I think
But no, I mean like socially.
part of the reason, this is my understanding, that they did it also is because they would be funny, we would be laughing, and then they would transition very swiftly into something very serious that made people very somber. And so at one point they were
I guess
saying
you
like,
know when you
why is it that you're only interested in hearing me and listening to me when I'm performing? Like, you'll accept like trans folks and non-binary folks as like a performance piece and to find joy in. Like, you'll find joy in us, but you won't hire us as your faculty, you won't hire us as your staff, you won't like support us as students.
There's also pasta.
It's also very SU specific. I don't know if they do that for everything or if they were inspired
Might be more excited.
the students of SU, which is like very, very intense. And they like suspended operations. Oh, you were talking about that. So yeah, it was a really interesting mixture of it, and like the second, like it was very serious, you started laughing, but you still remember the serious. And the moment like enough time had passed for you to think that like this is just hilarious, they slip back into being very somber.
So I'm trying to write my recent paper for queer outlaws on queer negativity and queer affect, and the ways in which like being like upending cis hetero ideas of how you should respond in situations and what happiness and sadness look like. And I thought that would be a really interesting point of view because there's like lots of discussions about like
Are you talking about a paper?
yeah.
Do we have a paper the other day?
No.
Yeah, it's like,
I'm thinking about my future final paper for queer
yeah,
outlaws.
okay, you're way further. Oh, that's why we have.
Like there's a lot of talk about queer negativity and like we don't want what the cis het thing to happen like a marriage. It's just a picket fence and stuff like that. There's not a lot of talking queer negativity flipped around, whereas like finding joy at a funeral or finding joy
You
in
guys become so radical, and I'm so proud.
like to the point of that like our lives are going to be short, they're going to be limited, they're going to so we can have happiness for the time we're like turning like the radical joy that has people like poor working class folks dancing in the streets on a Tuesday night. And it's the same kind of like radical joy that leads to.
I wish you'd come. They talked about that. I feel like
a friend of mine had a concert at 8:15, and I promised her I'd be there. So otherwise I would have gone.
Like, we should talk a lot about how, like, in reality, like, all the, I just,
Oh,
do you have a question?
I do. I was waiting for you to.
No, go ahead.
Are any of
We're
these
just shooting
mics?
the shit.
Can I take a mic? May I take the mic?
I'm so confused.
No.
Yeah. Like, what?
Yeah. I think Maxie made all of them.
Yeah, basically, talk I don't remember what it was exactly. The other thing is, like, they don't allow recordings, which I totally understand, but then I was like, I can't remember what any of these things.
I would have been taking notes in the
I
audience.
know, I left my
I would've
notes on.
been like,
I was like, but they talked a lot about.
Never mind. Wait, for what? Just
Basically,
drinking out
like,
there
the
now?
reason cis-het people are the way that they are is because they
Because you can see
see
what you're drinking.
a kind of freedom that, like, queer trans people have that they don't
Yeah,
have
it's practical. Do you know how much is left in there?
They have access to like everything
You
else.
can't have depth
Yeah.
perception as well.
But that's what gets them so
Also, why
angry,
is it
and
why
then,
is it such a
like,
hard decision?
I regret asking.
And about how, like,
Hello.
cis-het
So you
people are
learned
just,
it.
like,
Always.
slowly.
Same. I know.
I forget where I saw it, but I remember seeing a piece where it was like queer people are
And we're not talking about the river.
outlandish, like acts of violence.
I'm all
Like,
Sagittarius. You want
whereas cis-het people are dying slowly every single day, and that like the depressing
I'm all
existence
Sagittarius, and I
is
don't
why
seek
they
out
want to kill and turn violence against queer people
No.
because like
I'm not talking about the river.
Someone's really young. They're really good at none of them.
They also, like, literally everything I do, I feel like turns into a
Just
form
wanna
of
rely on
racist stuff.
This is them
I
having
always do this.
you can throw my sweatshirt wherever if you need to.
Because like people ask them like very like basic questions and they turn it into like a poem and I'm like, can you stop? Can you like stop being like this?